This doesn't end when they understand you. It doesn't end when they miss you. It doesn't even end when they come back. It ends when you stop organizing your life around someone who could only love you. When you stayed small. And that moment, that's the one. They feel too late. Most people think the dynamic ends with a conversation, with closure, with accountability, with an apology that finally lands. But that's not how this works. Because this dynamic was never held together by words. It was held together by regulation, by you sensing their mood before they spoke, by you adjusting your tone so they wouldn't shut down, by you swallowing needs so the connection could survive. You weren't just loving them, you were stabilizing them. And the moment you stopped doing that, even quietly, the dynamic began to collapse. Not loudly, not dramatically, internally, because suddenly, their nervous system had no external anchor. And for the first time, they felt the weight of their own emotions without you absorbing them. This is where most people misunderstand what walking away really means. You didn't leave to punish them. You didn't pull back to teach them a lesson. You simply stopped performing emotional labor they never learned to do for themselves. And that's why this moment is the real ending. Not because you disappeared, but because you stopped managing the bond. When you were still there, the dynamic could continue forever, even unhappy, even unequal, because your presence kept the system regulated. But once you shifted internally, once you stopped compensating, the bond lost its stabilizer, and something terrifying happened for them. They had to feel themselves. This is where their confusion starts. They'll say things like, "I don't know what changed. I just feel off. I feel like I lost something important." But what they lost wasn't you. It was access. Access to your emotional availability. Without responsibility. Access to your reassurance. Without reciprocity. Access to your depth. Without having to meet it. And here's the part that matters for you. You didn't become cold. You didn't become avoidant. You didn't shut down. You became self-contained. You stopped leaking energy into a system that only worked when you overfunctioned. And that's why this ending doesn't look dramatic. It looks quiet, grounded, almost invisible from the outside. But internally, it's irreversible. Because once you experience what it feels like to no longer regulate someone else's nervous system, you can't unfeel it. You can't go back to carrying emotional weight that was never yours. This is the point where the fantasy breaks. The fantasy that, if you just loved better, explained more clearly, waited longer, they would finally meet you. That fantasy dissolves here, not in anger, but in clarity. You begin to see that the connection wasn't failing because you wanted too much. It was failing because you were doing too much. And for the first time, you stop asking, "Why couldn't they love me the way I needed?" and start asking, "Why was I willing to disappear to keep this alive?" That question changes everything because it turns the focus back to you. And once that happens, the dynamic can't survive. What happens next is not what most people expect, because the moment you stop regulating them, they don't immediately miss you. They feel something far more destabilizing. They feel exposed. For the first time, their emotional state has no external buffer. No one is translating their feelings for them. No one is softening the edges. No one is absorbing the tension before it reaches their body. And that's when the nervous system reacts. Not with longing, with panic. But it doesn't look like panic yet. It looks like irritation, defensiveness, sudden certainty that you were the problem. This is the phase where they rewrite history, where they tell themselves, "You were too intense, too emotional, too much," not because it's true, but because admitting the truth would mean facing something terrifying, that without you, they don't know how to feel safe inside themselves. And that realization hits in waves. At first, they distract. They stay busy. They scroll. They replace. They rationalize. They convince themselves they're finally free. Free from expectations. Free from depth. Free from emotional responsibility. And for a short while, That illusion works because avoidance systems are very good at surviving on numbness. But numbness has a cost, and eventually, something quiet breaks through, usually at night, or in stillness, or in moments where no one is watching. A sense of emptiness they can't explain, a heaviness in the chest, with no clear source, an irritation with people who don't feel familiar. Because here's what they didn't expect. Your presence was regulating more than the relationship. It was regulating them. Your attunement, your emotional intelligence, your consistency. It wasn't just connection. It was containment. And now that it's gone, their system doesn't know where to place its feelings. This is where they start thinking about you, without wanting to, not in a romantic way at first, in flashes, moments where your name appears, out of nowhere, moments where they replay conversations they once dismissed, moments where they feel a strange pull and immediately shut it down. Because remembering you means remembering what they avoided, your steadiness, your clarity, your ability to sit with emotion without fleeing. And that mirrors back something painful, their inability to do the same. This is when guilt starts forming, not conscious guilt, somatic guilt, a tightness, a restlessness, a sense of having lost something they don't know how to name. They may reach out here, not to repair, to regulate, a message, a breadcrumb, a casual check-in, something small enough to test whether you're still available, without risking vulnerability. And this is the moment that defines whether the dynamic truly ends. If you respond the old way, soothing, understanding, accommodating, the system stabilizes again, and the cycle resets. But if you don't, if you respond differently, or not at all, something profound happens. Their nervous system has to face the loss fully, not the loss of you as a person, the loss of access, access to your emotional labor, access to your grounding presence, access to the part of you that made intimacy feel safe, without demanding they grow. This is where grief begins. Not clean grief, fragmented grief, grief that shows up as anger, as withdrawal, as sudden idealization of you, followed by dismissal. They oscillate because they're torn between two realities, the safety of distance and the pain of emptiness. And here's the part you need to hear clearly. None of this means you were meant to stay. None of this means you abandoned them. This pain is not evidence that you did something wrong. It's evidence that the bond was sustained by imbalance, that you were carrying emotional weight they never learned to hold. And now that you're not, their system is recalibrating. Painfully. This is why avoidants often say they feel worse after it ends. Not because the relationship was perfect, but because the regulation is gone. And without it, they have to confront themselves. Some do. Most don't. Many choose distraction instead. Another relationship, another connection, another source of regulation. But the pattern follows. Because what they lost wasn't you specifically. It was the version of themselves that felt stable only when someone else was doing the work. And unless that changes, the ending repeats. This is where your role shifts completely. You are no longer inside the dynamic. You're observing it. And from this distance, you begin to see the truth. You weren't difficult to love. You were emotionally available. In a system that relied on avoidance to survive, you weren't asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person to meet you where they had never been. This realization is not bitter. It's liberating because it releases you from self-blame, from overanalysis, from the fantasy that one more explanation could have fixed everything. It couldn't, because the issue was never understanding. It was capacity. And now, as they sit with the consequences of no longer being regulated by you, you begin to feel something unfamiliar. Relief. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped carrying. And that relief is the signal that the ending is real. At this stage, something irreversible begins happening inside you. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Because once you stop regulating someone else, you don't just change the relationship. You change your internal orientation. You start noticing how much space you suddenly have. Mental space, emotional space, energetic space. At first, it feels strange, almost empty, because for so long, your nervous system was tuned outward, scanning, adjusting, anticipating. You were always one step ahead of their mood, their withdrawal, their silence. You learned to read micro shifts, tone changes, response delays. You called it love, connection, understanding. But now, without that constant monitoring, your system begins to settle back into itself. And that's when the truth starts surfacing, not all at once. In moments, you realize how often you were bracing, how rarely you were fully relaxed, how much emotional work you normalized. You begin to see the imbalance without defending it anymore. And this is the part that often surprises people. You don't feel angry first. You feel clear. Clear about what you tolerated. Clear about what you excused. Clear about how much of yourself you minimized to keep the bond alive. This clarity can feel unsettling because it dismantles the fantasy. The fantasy that if you had said it better, waited longer, been softer, been less, things would have changed. But clarity doesn't attack you. It simply shows you reality. And reality says, you were already doing the most in a system that required you to do too much. As this clarity deepens, your body responds. You breathe differently. Your shoulders drop. Your chest doesn't tighten at the thought of silence anymore. You stop checking, stop rereading, stop waiting for something to land. And that's when a subtle grief arrives. Not grief for them, grief for the version of you that worked so hard to be chosen. That version of you thought love had to be earned through endurance, through patience, through emotional labor. Letting go of that identity is tender because it carried hope, but it also carried exhaustion. And now, as that identity dissolves, a new one begins forming. One that doesn't chase clarity, one that doesn't explain itself repeatedly, one that doesn't self-abandon to maintain closeness. This new identity doesn't announce itself. It simply stops participating in dynamics that require self-erasure. This is the point where the dynamic truly ends. Not when they leave, not when they come back, but when you no longer feel pulled to re-enter the emotional loop. And here's what's important. This shift is felt by them, even if you never speak again, because the bond was energetic. As much as it was emotional, they felt you carrying them. They felt your attunement. And now, they feel the absence of that holding, not as loss, as disorientation. They may try to name it. They may tell themselves, you changed, that you became distant, cold, unreachable. But what actually happened is simpler. You stopped abandoning yourself. And that creates a boundary no explanation can cross. This is why closure doesn't come from conversations here. It comes from embodiment, from the way you move on, without hostility, from the way you stop reacting, from the way your energy no longer rushes toward them. And once that happens, something remarkable takes place. You stop needing them to understand. You stop needing validation for your experience. You stop hoping they'll see you the way you see yourself now, because your system no longer needs that confirmation. This is the moment where self-worth stops being conceptual and becomes lived. You don't affirm it. You demonstrate it by what you no longer tolerate, by what you no longer pursue, by what you no longer explain. And this is an empowerment in a loud way. It's calm, grounded, stable. You don't feel superior. You feel finished. Finished carrying what was never yours. Finished negotiating for presence. Finished mistaking inconsistency for depth. And this is why the dynamic cannot restart. Because dynamics require participation. And you've stepped out, not in anger, in awareness. By now, you're no longer asking when it will stop hurting. You're noticing that it already hurts differently. Not sharp, not consuming, quieter, more distant. Because the pain was never just about them. It was about how long you stayed in a position that required you to shrink. And now that you're no longer there, your nervous system is recalibrating. This is important because healing doesn't arrive as happiness first. It arrives as neutrality. You wake up, and they're not the first thought. You hear their name, and your body doesn't react. You scroll, and don't look for signs. Not because you're forcing yourself, but because the charge is gone. This is how the dynamic truly ends. Not with closure from them, but with closure inside your body. Your system has learned. That connection doesn't require tension. That love doesn't require self-surveillance. That intimacy doesn't demand performance. And once your body learns that, it doesn't unlearn it. This is why going back no longer feels tempting, even if nostalgia visits, even if memories soften, because you remember how it felt to be you in that dynamic. Not just the highs, the constant regulation, the emotional vigilance, the subtle anxiety. And you don't miss that. You start choosing differently, without making it a rule. You're drawn to steadiness, to emotional availability. That doesn't need translation. To people who don't require you to manage their internal world. And this is where your power actually lives. Not in being desired, but in being self-contained. No longer leaking energy into situations that can't hold it. No longer hoping someone will rise to meet you. If you just stay long enough, you already know now. If someone is capable, they don't need to be carried. If someone is available, they don't need to be convinced. And if something requires you to abandon yourself to sustain it, it's not alignment. It's conditioning. This awareness doesn't make you guarded. It makes you discerning. You don't close your heart. You protect your nervous system. And there's a difference, because a protected nervous system can actually open safely. This is where your relationships change. Not because you demand more, but because you no longer accept less. You stop explaining your needs as if they're negotiable. You stop apologizing for wanting consistency. You stop overfunctioning to keep others comfortable. And what's left is simple. You. Unfiltered, unmanaged, unburdened. This version of you is not louder, not colder, not distant, just grounded. And grounding is magnetic, in a way chaos never was. Some people won't be able to follow you here, not because you're wrong, but because this level of self-connection exposes where they're disconnected. And that's okay. You don't need to be chosen by everyone. You only need to stop choosing what costs you your peace. This is where the dynamic ends, not with rejection, but with self-return. If this reached you, it's because your system is already shifting. You don't need to rush it. Just notice it. And if something in you felt seen while listening, leave a heart. Not for me, for the part of you that finally stopped carrying what was never yours to hold.